Mm.
How are you doing?
In Yirtzeh Hashem, this is correct, but just to see, Kat, is there any way to check to make sure that this is?
Is there a red light showing on the board?
Yeah. Okay, that's a good sign. Okay, so thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And maybe you could say a sentence or two to start about who you are and why, because I don't have your bio in front of me. So
that's fine. That's the least interesting part of this, but I'll happily give you my bio. Again, just give me one second, and then I'm just checking something, and then we'll be able to start. Okay. Okay, I'll happily tell you who I am. My name is Michael Marmur. I am a rabbi, a Reform rabbi ordained at the Hebrew Union College, which is also the place that I work. I'm an associate professor of Jewish theology and have been at the Jerusalem campus of HUC for longer than anyone can remember. Over the years, I've fulfilled a number of administrative roles at HUC. I was the dean of the college in Jerusalem for a decade, and then I was the provost of the school, which means I was kind of the chief academic officer for our system of 4 campuses and ran around between them in the days when you could actually run around between campuses. A couple of years ago, I stepped down from that position, and since then I've been a member of the faculty here in Jerusalem, and I teach, I write. I wrote a book on Abraham Joshua Heschel a couple of years ago about the way Heschel reads sources and what he does with them. I've just published a book, edited a book with my friend David Ellenson, an anthology of American Jewish thought published by Brandeis. I do Jewish thought type things. That's my day job. I am the chair of Rabbis for Human Rights, which is a human rights organization. Was over 30 years old, based here in Israel. It's perhaps known, one way of kind of placing it for folks in the kind of tikkun sphere is that Tru'ah is an organization that began as a North American arm of Rabbis for Human Rights. And as happened, and probably as ought to have happened, it grew into its own thing, because the days in which a North American organization will be a branch of an Israeli one, or an Israeli organization will be a branch of a North American one, those days may indeed have passed, and instead we need to look for different models of connection and dialogue with each other. So RHR, it was established by a bunch of mainly, but not exclusively, non-Orthodox rabbis in Israel. Today, we have about 80 members from humanist, reconstructionist, reform, conservative, and various flavors of Orthodox rabbis who identify and pay membership. I meet hundreds of rabbis who tell me that they're members of Rabbis for Human Rights, but since I know how many have actually paid their dues, I'm aware of the gulf between aspiration and expenditure, let's put it that way. So it's an organization that has a number of different foci of activity. We, for many years, Arik Asherman was our leader. No longer. Arik is a friend and still a member of our organization, but some years ago he went off and established one and then another organization. And Arik for many years was the face of Rabbis for Human Rights, and he was and continues to be a fearless, all the only images that are coming to mind are inappropriate because they're bellicose. He's not a warrior for peace, but he's been putting himself and his life on the line for issues that matter to him for a long time, for decades. And he did that in the framework of RHR for many of those years. These days, we're under new management. We have a wonderful Mankal, executive director, a man called Avi Davush, and we have a board, etc. That's who. That's the organization, Rabbis for Human Rights.
Okay. So, could you share with us your reflections on tshuva for American Jews?
Yes, Rabbi Lerner was kind enough to ask me to do something I'm not inclined to do, which is to tell somebody to beat out an al-chet on somebody else's chest, or to tell the other person what the tshuva is that they ought to be making. So I'm either incapable or unwilling to do that, but that won't stop me from saying something in the next couple of minutes, which you may find to be resonant or helpful. My father, many years ago, who's also a rabbi, Dov Marmur, wrote a book in which he coined an expression which is, I think, relevant in this context, and that is vicarious Judaism. Vicarious Judaism is the dynamic by which we find somebody else to fulfill our Jewish fantasies or illusions or whatever they might be. Vicarious Judaism is alive and well in the religious sphere, where we often find somebody fantastically pious, in whom we can invest, and in whom we vest all kinds of powers, magical and metaphysical, so that they can be the Jew we're not. It's certainly a political dynamic whereby we find somebody else who we often can make into a hero or sometimes into a villain and load off all of our Jewish stuff onto them. So I'm not going to be engaged in Jewish life because of that Jew, or I can never be as perfect or as excellent or as fulfilled as that one. Often the relationship between Israeli Judaism, Israeli Jews, and North America has involved a kind of weird dynamic in which we engage in what I would call vicarious practices, one vis-a-vis the others. There's a lot of fantasies about North American Jewish life within Israel. You are all, well, you're all super wealthy and successful. You're all super assimilating. You are, I don't know what, you're all sorts of sometimes self-contradictory things in this fantasy that is built. And often in my experience, the reality, the political reality of Israel, but also the personal reality of particular Israeli Jews, they are vested from afar with all kinds of either demonic or magical powers, which don't really quite reflect the reality. So my first, hopefully elegantly sidestepping the thing I was asked to do, my first request would be that whatever it is, whatever place you have for thinking about and caring about what takes place in Israel in your package of tshuva, and goodness knows this year, the tshuva bundle is so heavy that the cart is not strong enough to hold all of the contents. But I would hope and implore you not to engage in some kind of vicarious activity. Rather than ask the question, either in some sort of glowing and unrealistic way about those, those heroic folks, or indeed in some unnecessarily binary and sort of clumsy, caricatured way, those awful, terrible invaders and conquerors. Rather than us play those games with each other, I would ask you, as I try to do in my tshuva practice, to think, what is a useful role? What is a necessary, what's a crucial role that I can play if I do indeed care passionately, viscerally, about what is playing out in contemporary Israel? I want to give you first of all, the biblical verse that immediately springs to mind as Rabbi Lerner asked me to fulfill this task, which I am spending many minutes telling you how I'm not doing, is the verse from Proverbs, from Mishlei, particularly the first half perhaps of that verse. Ne'emanim pitzei ohev. Wounds inflicted by a lover or by a loved one are ne'emanim, are faithful, are long-lasting. A lot of the question of how you relate to and respond to what's taking place in Israel is not, in my view, the depth of your anguish or your anger, the nature of your opinion, your particular position on this question or that question. It is, in my experience, a function of how much love you feel for your fellow human being, in this case, for your fellow Jew trying to work things out here in the state of Israel. Israel's situation at the moment, I want to say this differently. For people who have an essentially progressive worldview, there aren't many places on the map right now where it's a happy place to be a citizen. And I want to tell you that Israel is quite certainly not one of those places. The kind of moral and political topography of this country has moved discernibly to the right over the course of the last years and decades. One could have an argument, which we don't need to get into now, as how far left it ever was here in Israel. But things have moved to a point where many of my fellow citizens in Israel don't actually see, can't actually imagine, can't conjure up in their imagination an alternative vision to the kind of inexorable dynamic of power and its abuse that plays out here in the state of Israel. So, to some degree, that's a testament to the political survival of Benjamin Netanyahu. Don't forget that there are now voters in this country who've never really known any other reality than Netanyahu being in charge, or largely. He's been the default option. And we're now witness to a remarkable situation whereby speak to most Israeli voters about how they feel the government is doing in our current crisis. I speak to you now in a country where the death rate, thankfully, from corona is still relatively low. The infection rate is world beating. No country has got a more rapidly growing rate of infection, to the best of my knowledge. You know, this fulfills the great Israeli dream of being on the map and on top of the world, but not necessarily in the way that we, you know, this is not startup nation. This is whatever the alternative would be. So you have a situation whereby ask most Israelis, and they're disgusted and dismayed, and they think that the government is discredited, but ask them how they're going to vote. And solidly you will see a center-right, or not even center, just right-wing orientation coming through loud and clear. Partly because of this kind of stickability factor of Netanyahu, but take him out of the equation. When one day he's no longer the prime minister, something has happened in Israeli society which has moved Israelis far from what you and I might call a progressive agenda. Now, rather than us bemoan this fact, we need to face up to what I would argue is a basic choice. To disengage, and I think there's ample evidence that many within the North American Jewish community are taking this option. To disengage and say, it's a lost cause, Israel no longer, in the vicarious dynamic, Israel is no longer doing it for me. The model of Israel is no longer one that presses my vicarious buttons, and therefore, to hell with them. You will not be surprised to hear, not greatly enamored of that option. I completely understand where it comes from, and God knows that the Israeli government, Israeli policy, and many parts of Israeli society make it very easy to come to that kind of conclusion. But if you don't find yourself in that camp, if you are in essence an ohev or an ohevet, if you still feel a visceral sense of identification and love, if you still believe that what is playing out here, not in 1 year or in 1 decade, but in the course of the coming generations, is just a remarkable chapter in the Jewish story. If for you, disengagement from this, from what's happening in Israel is not an option, or not something that you look at with enthusiasm, then the question becomes, what are effective ways of inflicting wounds of love, of making a critique from a position of love that may actually have some impact in this country? I don't have a magic bullet or a great solution for you in this regard. My general recommendation would be, rather than to think about Israel like this in some great big abstract way, to find, Israel is both Israel and also Jacob or Yaakov, right? There's a particular personal dimension. To find individuals, cultural initiatives, political initiatives, civil society initiatives, people trying in all sorts of remarkable and energetic ways, people doing things, by the way, in unexpected places. It's remarkable. We've got used to thinking in very limited ways. There's a secular community with which I'm more easily identified. There's the Orthodox with whom I have nothing to do with them. Look within the Orthodox world today, and you'll find all sorts of remarkable initiatives, some to do with sexual identity and personal freedom questions, some to do with new kinds of religious creativity. There's actually a lot of stuff which I consider to be engaging and significant on the ground. In a second, I'm going to say something about where the heart of the teshuvah might lie. But if we're looking for practical responses, my request to you, my recommendation would be, find a someone or a something that is that speaks to a possible Israel for you, that relates to a possible vision of incremental and hopefully also structural and substantive change, tikkun, that's a word that you might want to think about, that can take place in this society. In the last couple of minutes that I have, I want to share with you an X-rated midrash. It's so X-rated that it really did not find its way into any of the major collections of or compendia of midrashim. It was first published by the great scholar of midrash, Louis Ginsberg, a century ago. He found it in the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, attached to a Yemenite mahzor, a festival prayer book, and its provenance is a subject of great discussion, which is not relevant to my next 3 minutes. Here's the first part of the midrash in my retelling. I apologize in advance, it is X-rated. Adam and Eve are in the garden. Samael, one of the satanic, iteration of the devil in Second Temple literature and beyond, Samael decides to play a game. He creates an avatar in the form of a child. No child currently exists. There's only Adam and Eve. And he comes to Eve in the garden. Adam is out on a gardening expedition. And he says to Eve, "Would you look after my kid? I've got a convention somewhere. I have to go out of town." Now, this becomes the earliest case of babysitting in human history. Eve says, "Sure, I'll look after the child." Adam comes home from the garden and finds Eve's attention no longer focused exclusively on him, but now directed to this child. And he asks an appropriate question: whose child is this? which you have to say is reasonable in the circumstances. Oh, she says, yes, Samael came round, dropped him off, we're looking after him. The child is in the form of a baby, so the Midrash says, and cries and cries and cries and won't stop crying. And Adam eventually loses his patience with this child, and so this X-rated Midrash says, he kills the child. That's not the end of the shocking Midrash, because this isn't really a human being, it's a kind of satanic, or it's from the dark side. The child is dead, but doesn't stop crying. Adam is beside himself with fury and rage at his own impotence, and he cuts up the child. And excuse me, I really do apologize for this. But so awful is this creation of Samael that every piece of the child keeps on crying out, increasing the noise. Adam, in the end, can think of only one way of coping with this awfulness. He cooks and serves up the child. And in an inversion of the Genesis story, where Adam is offered some fruit to eat, here Adam offers Eve a meal made up of, as we know, the reader, of the parts of this child. Adam and Eve having ingested this dreadful meal, Samael comes back and says to Eve, I'd like to pick up the kid now, it's time to kill, They then do what happens in the book of Genesis. We don't know, we never saw this, we didn't eat it, we don't know what you're talking about, we've never seen this child. And Samael calls them out for lying. And in the most heartbreaking moment of this Midrash, a voice calls out from within the human heart, from within the heart of Adam and the heart of Eve. And the voice says to Samael, you can go now. We don't need you anymore. They have ingested me. They've taken me into their hearts, and I will be in their hearts and the hearts of their descendants forever. Why am I telling you this awful story? Because I think this is, like the best of our Midrashim, a piercing reflection on the human condition. We, here in Israel for sure, and I'm not going to start telling you about your society, but you could think about this too. When trying to confront some of the horrors that we have perpetrated or that have been perpetrated in our name, do the very worst thing in order to bury the evidence. We ingest it, we internalize it, we take it into ourselves. And we then have a permanent case of metaphysical heartburn. Our hearts are heavy with the stuff that we've done, we or the societies we live in, that we thought we could make disappear by internalizing them. But they will, in the end, come out. I'm proud to be a citizen of the state of Israel. Proud is a word I don't use lightly, and I don't mean in the puffed out, look at me, I'm waving a flag kind of a way. You won't find many flags on me. I'm proud because, even however awful that word pride is, because I feel that much has been achieved and much will yet be achieved in this remarkable and improbable adventure that the state of Israel represents. But I refuse to do what many of us are asked to do, which is to close our eyes to all of the sins that we have ingested. I believe that the best form of teshuvah, I'm not going to give an elaborate and unpleasant digestive metaphor here, but I do think that the work of teshuvah, for you where you are, and for us where we are, is to try and face up to that which has been perpetrated by us or in our name, that we would rather forget and ignore. as Rabbi Lerner and all of you are well aware, this plays out for sure on the environmental level, on the meta level. It plays out in terms of the the systematic abuse of power, of the othering of the other in so many negative and problematic ways. For Israel, and I dare say for America too. I saw a movie just the new movie by Edward Norton this week, in which one of the characters has an amazing speech about America, post-war America, where it says more or less what I'm trying to say to you now. We went over there, we won the Second World War, we dropped the bomb. We thought that all that use of power could be forgotten, could be buried, and we could go back and have a suburban life. But once the power has been unleashed, it doesn't stay under the surface. It comes out, the heartburn continues to burn. We in Israel, for sure, think about, I promise you I'm coming to the end of this now, think about a great improbable fantasy about Israel. It's Paul Newman in Exodus. This was the picture we so much wanted to believe. You're beautiful and rugged and blue-eyed. You fought a war, but what you really want to do is stay at home and read Nietzsche and play the violin. And that somehow you can live this fantastic, high cultural Western existence whilst being forced to face up to some grim military realities. In truth, of course, that never plays out in that particular way. We still are trying, Israeli society still tries, still has cultural aspirations. But to believe that you can bury the evidence by eating it, as it were, by ingesting it, and that then suddenly there'll be no problems, is a dangerous illusion. So what am I asking you folks in North America to do? Apart from, I'm sorry to have given you bad dreams with an awful midrashic metaphor. Rather than simply tell me or me tell you everything we're doing wrong, let's try to face up together to this dynamic whereby we have perpetrated, you might want to say we were forced to, we had to, we didn't want to. It doesn't matter right now. We have with our own hands in the business of building our comfortable lives and our comfortable societies, been involved in activities, in attitudes, in approaches, which have to be faced up to with honesty. They cannot be buried. They cannot be swallowed. In the end, they murmur in our hearts and they demand to be addressed. Maybe the best thing I could hope and suggest for us, rather than you criticize my policy on this and I'll criticize your policy on that, is for us to think together about how this process of perpetrating misuses of power and then swallowing them up, how we can together work out a way to break out of that cycle of heartburn in which we seem to be gripped. That's what I have to offer you this year. I was teaching earlier today my students at the Hebrew Union College, and I taught them a passage from your book, Rabbi Lerner, and from Jewish Renewal, your extraordinary reading of the Akedah, because it seems appropriate as we come to this period of Rosh Hashanah. And I love that reading very much, because what you do is portray that moment in terms of Abraham being faced with a question. Will he perpetrate once again a cycle of abuse and dysfunction? Or will he have a revelation? That's Abraham's real revelation, that it doesn't have to be this way. The story doesn't have to end this time the way it ended before. My greeting for all of you on this occasion of Rosh Hashanah is that we manage to find ways of facing up to that which we have ingested, and that we engage in a conversation with each other that gets beyond the usual pitfalls of vicarious Judaism.
Yashigayach, Yashigayach. How do I do that? Let's see. Where does it say to end it?
The record thing, the record button at the bottom.
Yeah, let's see if I can find that. How about end?
No, that's gonna end the call.
Oh, okay.
Never mind, just, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, we just have to cut it out. Where is that record button?
Forget it, Michael, just finish your conversation.
So,
Yeah, you'll work out how to,
Yeah.
to
So listen,
cut this part of it.
I very much appreciate what you've said, and you're a sophisticated thinker, and I really wish to have more contact with you.
I'd be delighted, Michael. I really would be. Thank you.
But for the so if ever you want to write anything, either about Judaism or about Israel or about anything else, please send me an email with what you would like to write. I mean, or your article. I'd love to have it in Tikkun.
Thank you. I will. I've been thinking of doing something. I'll try and come up with something and send you in the course of this year, whenever it is, when I get round to it, I'll send you a piece. See what you make of it. What's the usual size of article that you like to publish?
About any place between 1,200 and 2,500 words.
Okay, that's good.
Okay. And I'm sorry I didn't know you better, because when we were in, Kat and I were in Israel 2 summers ago for the summer, and I would have loved to hang out with you a little bit. But anyway.
I did meet you a few times. I'm very friendly with Levi and Paula, and with them or through them, when you in previous in the old days when you come, I met you, but it was a long time ago, and you've met a lot of people, so there's no need to remember that. So let's hope for next time, and I'll send you a piece if I get round to it. I will.
Okay, Bli Neder, yes.
Bli Neder that I write it, and Bli Neder that you publish it.
Okay. But,
all right, all the best. Shana Tova.
Connect to you, and Shana Tova, and Gemar Chatima Tova.
Chatima Tova.
Bye-bye. And now I'm going to close this.
Right here. See right here. Pause, stop recording.
Where? Oh, I see.
Yeah, it says pause, stop recording.